Paris, the city of lights. When we think of Paris, we think of beautiful French cuisine, fine art, romance, and the sparkling lights of the Eiffel Tower. Most of the time, we don't think of death and decay. But the reality is that Paris has an official population of about 2 million people. But the unofficial population is much higher, around 8 million to be precise. But where are those 6 million secret inhabitants of the City of Lights? Well, they're dead. The bones of 6 million people line the maze of underground tunnels that make up the Paris Catacombs. In the 12th century, the Holy Innocent Cemetery was built in Paris. As is often the case in big cities, outdoor space was limited, and was becoming more and more limited as people flocked to Paris to make their way in the world. Eventually, the Holy Innocent Cemetery became overwhelmed, and the decision was made to shirk individual burials in favour of giant mass graves that held up to 1,500 bodies. This seems like a good, albeit undignified, plan. And so officials continued with open mass graves dug and filled ad nauseum. And it worked. For a time. The creators of this room-saving scheme didn't live to see its outcome, but the people of 17th century Paris certainly did. The bodies, stacked high, simply weren't buried deep enough, and in the 500 years that had passed, more and more bones began to protrude from the soil, and the graveyard was literally littered with the skeletal remains of Parisians long past. But that wasn't the worst part. Decomposition is a fascinating but also complex process, and it needs to occur in the right conditions. The graveyard was full to the brim with human remains that weren't buried deep enough, and noxious fumes leaked into the air above the soil, which disallowed for any oxygen to enter the soil. Soon the graveyard was not only full of human bones, but it was also full of a substance called corpse wax, which is exactly as inviting as it sounds. This posed a huge problem. The air was noxious, and the surrounding area smelled horrific, so no one wanted to live or set up shop there, and Louis XVI was eventually forced to take action when a nearby basement wall collapsed and bodies spilled into the building from the graveyard. All of the graveyards within the city walls were closed, and there was a great turmoil over what to do with the bodies that were publicly rotting in Holy Innocent Graveyard. But the answer was obvious. They would just put them deeper underground. For 2 years, workers exhumed and moved millions of bodies from the Holy Innocent Graveyard to the winding catacombs that existed under the city. But where do these catacombs come from? And why are they there? The answer is actually really simple. They're mines. Paris was built from limestone, which was mined from beneath the city as far back as Roman times. It seems bizarre that a city would be built on top of a series of mine shafts and tunnels, but it was. Because as time passed, people simply forgot the mine shafts were there. And it has resulted in some really interesting Parisian laws. For example, if you buy a house in Paris, you also buy the ground and the tunnels beneath it, so that if the house collapses into the caverns, well, it's your own fault. The same engineer who mapped the tunnels in the 1700s was also responsible for the removal of the bodies into the tunnels. Initially, the bones were simply stacked into the tunnels, but eventually the workers created decorative designs with the human remains. When you visit what is now known as the ossuary of the catacombs, you are greeted with walls stacked high with skulls and femurs and bones made into beautiful shapes like hearts. There were a group of people who benefited greatly from the moving of the bodies. And that was the candle and the soap makers. They relieved the city of tons of corpse wax and used it to make soap and candles to sell back to the inhabitants of Paris. Before we get into the ghost stories, there are a couple of stories I stumbled across while researching this episode that aren't necessarily creepy but are definitely interesting. For obvious health and safety reasons, the catacombs are mostly closed to the public, but also because of the Parisian law that states that if you buy a house above the catacombs, you also buy the ground beneath it. entering the catacombs comes with the risk of trespassing on private property. You can have a guided tour of around 1.5 kilometres, but the rest of the 350-kilometre area is off limits. But that doesn't stop people exploring them secretly. And these people are known as cataphiles. The tunnels are home to regular raves, parties, art installations, and secret performances. In 2017, a gang of criminals used the catacombs to dig their way into the wine cellar of a rich Parisian townhouse and stole €250,000 worth of wine. But the most interesting group of cataphiles began their explorations in 1981, when 6 teenagers pulled off an incredible stunt. They used the tunnels to mine their way into the Department of Telecommunications in Paris and stole one singular item, the complete map of the catacombs. The group became known as Les UX, or the Urban Experiment. They became an established group which now has subdivisions and groups with dedicated tasks. In 2004, police in Paris were conducting a routine training session in the catacombs when they were suddenly met with the disturbing sound of a pack of howling dogs. Determined to continue the exercise, the police made their way deeper into the tunnel, seemingly abandoned for centuries. As they neared the end of the tunnel that opened into a cavern, they were halted in their tracks. It wasn't just a cavern anymore. It was a fully functional cinema, complete with a bar and a restaurant. Les UX had carved seats into the stone walls, built a working bar and a small restaurant, hooked the place up with electricity and phone lines, and the dogs they heard? They were a motion-triggered warning system to give cinema-goers time to escape if their event was discovered. The police returned a few days later to find the entire cinema dismantled, and the only trace was the seats carved into the stone. Over the years, Les UX became dedicated to restoration projects, and at one point they secretly restored the entirety of the Pantheon clock to complete working order. Fascinating as these stories are, we're here for stories of things that go bump in the night. And in this case, things that go bump in the night deep, deep underground. 6 million bodies were unceremoniously dug up and piled beneath the city. But the catacombs have claimed lives of unwitting people since then. When you approach the infamous ossuary, there is an inscription over the door that reads, "Stop. This is the Empire of the Dead." In 1990, a group of cataphiles were exploring the catacombs and came across a curious little item. They found a video camera sitting in the middle of one of the tunnels. Naturally curious, the cataphiles took the camera and brought it along their journey. When they eventually got above ground, they removed the tape and were delighted to find that the tape was still intact. But their delight turned to horror when they watched the footage. The footage was grainy and dark, and it appeared that the camera was being held by a singular person, most likely a man, who was on his own deep in the tunnels. They could tell that he was deep in a part of the tunnels that is only frequented by the most experienced cataphiles because there was no graffiti on the walls surrounding the man. But it was the sounds that really disturbed the cataphiles. The man was clearly lost within the tombs. He was panicked and breathing heavily, and suddenly he dropped the camera and ran, sprinting through the tunnels. The camera continued rolling until eventually the tape ran out. The cataphiles took the footage to a filmmaker and they launched a search for the man. But with 350 kilometres of tunnels to search, they knew there was little chance of finding him alive or finding him at all. And he was never found. But there is something striking about the video which has caused it to remain in paranormal conversation. And that is that there are many who believe that the video depicts a man being chased. And if that is the case, who or what could be chasing someone deep in the tunnels beneath Paris. There are those, of course, who believe that the footage is fake, and some who believe that the footage was faked by the filmmaker in order to spend some time in the limelight. But whether it is real or fake, there are numerous people who have become lost within the catacombs. During the French Revolution, a man named Philibert Apser was the caretaker and doorman at the Val de Grace Hospital. Philibert knew that the monks kept liquor down in the catacombs and decided that he would take it upon himself to go and collect some. It's probably reasonable to assume that he was likely drunk, but regardless of his state of inebriation, Philibert ended up becoming lost in the catacombs. He wandered the tunnels, with only a candle to find his way, and instead of making his way back to the surface, he went deeper and deeper into the warren of dark corridors, until eventually his candle snuffed out, and he was alone, in the pitch black darkness, with no hope of finding his way out. He'd died down there, alone. 11 years later, a group of cataphiles found his decomposed remains. The only identifying feature left was the large key for the hospital that was hanging from his belt. Philibert was buried where he was found, 2 meters away from an exit. And it is said that his soul is not at rest. It is believed that every year on the 3rd of November, the soul of Philibert is seen wandering the tunnels, with only a candle lighting his way. Cataphiles have reported a disembodied male voice whispering in their ear, trying to tempt them further into the tunnels, and others have reported candles being snuffed out as they light their way through the maze. The other most prominent ghost story about the Paris catacombs is the voices. Many cataphiles advise that people don't visit the catacombs after midnight because of the voices. It is believed that if you visit the tunnels after dark, the whispering voices of the remains that reside there try and coax you further into the shadows so that the tomb can claim another victim.
Stop. Where am I? Stop. Quickly.
Follow me.
Stop. Where are you going?
Where am I?
Quickly.
Follow
Stop.
me.
Where are you going?
Quickly. Where am
Stop.
I?
Where are you going?
It was tricky to find stories of people's experiences in the catacombs. Cataphiles tend to be secretive about their activities in the tunnels because many believe that too many people visiting leads to the desecration of remains, whether accidental or not. They also believe in keeping the tunnels free from rubbish and waste. But there was one place that I found stories about what lurks in the tunnels, and admittedly that was the Ghost Adventures Season 9 special. The episode centres on the found footage video from 1990 and the belief that the man was running from something in the tunnels. What is interesting about this episode is the eyewitness accounts that emerge from it. Thomas Benini was born and raised in Paris and was a regular in the tunnels. I always imagined that it would be like a rite of passage for Parisian teenagers to take a trip into the catacombs and scare themselves silly. Benini was exploring the catacombs with some friends when he realised that one of their group was no longer trailing behind them. They had somehow left him behind in the tunnels, and being experienced cataphiles, they knew this was bad news. Benini turned and sprinted back to where they had come from, terrified that his friend had become turned around or injured. As he ran, he tripped and landed flat on the damp, rocky floor of the tunnel. He looked up expecting to be greeted by his friends to help him up, but instead stood just in front of him was a man he had never seen before. He was wearing full 18th century dress and watched Benini silently. He raised his hand and pointed at some writing on the wall before disappearing into thin air. Benini scrambled to his feet, completely shocked by what he had just seen. The writing on the wall was a signature and a date, there since 1777. It was the mark of Charles Guillemot, the engineer who was originally tasked with mapping, stabilising and subsequently moving the bodies into the tunnel. Guillemot has been seen many times wandering the winding tunnels of the catacombs. I've always been vocal about my feelings about ghost adventures, and the episode quickly descended into allegations of a governmental cover-up of a creature that lives in the tunnels, but it did lead me to a curious little tale of a woman who claimed to have been abducted by a creature in the tunnel in the 1940s. And this section of her testimony was taken from the website LiveJournal. There are those who will claim I am insane. They will testify that I am mentally ill and unable to remember those weeks in the caves. I wish I could erase those memories from my mind, but the world must be warned. The monsters are down there. We must destroy them before they destroy us. I was a young woman of 19 years of age in 1943, proud of my ability as a student, and eagerly looking forward to marrying a young man who planned to be a physician. One night, we planned to meet at my fiancé's office building, join another couple, and have dinner in a small cafe. I arrived a few minutes late at my fiancé's building, and the old man who ran the elevator had left for the day. I decided to operate the lift for myself. I stepped inside to inspect the controls. There were no symbols to indicate whether the lift went up or down by moving the lever one way or another. Light-hearted and in love, I decided that if I ran the elevator into the basement, I could reverse the controls and go up the other stories. I made an error, and the elevator stopped in a dark basement. I reversed the controls, but my hand slipped, and I accidentally pushed on the down control. The elevator suddenly plunged down below the basement, folding through space as if the cable had broken. After a rapid drop, perhaps several hundred feet, the elevator stopped with a sudden lurch. I was so frightened as I fell onto the floor of the cage, sobbing and screaming. Through my terror-stricken mind, I heard a loud, guttural noise on the other side of the elevator door. The elevator door was torn open with a vicious slam, and I saw the most horrible beast in the world. The memory of that monster haunts my mind, and at night I cannot sleep without sedatives or sleeping pills. The face was of a pale, whitish colour. It had a short, twisted body that was covered in thick, bristly hair. The eyes were piggish, insensitive to any emotion, and gleaming with evil. The creature was fat, almost bloated. There were terrible scars and running sores all over most of its body. It had no neck, so its head seemed to be placed squarely atop his muscular shoulders. The face was the most horrible portion of this terrible features. It was much too large for its body, and totally devoid of hair. The skin was scarred and wrinkled. Its nose was fashioned more like a snout. It was nude, and its body looked like it never worn garments. A filthy animal smell filled the elevator. Mercifully, I fainted into unconsciousness. I had never known what happened in the elevator. Did they use it for an entry into the outside world? The woman then goes on to describe a plight that would not be out of place in a sci-fi B-movie, where she's held captive along with other women by these vile creatures and is eventually rescued by alleged starmen. On closer investigation, this tale of kidnap into the catacombs came from a book about the hollow earth theory and is likely used as pseudo-proof for their claims, something which is conveniently left out of the TV show. And it's also likely to be used to push other modern anti-Semitic rhetoric like the theory of the lizard people. But parts of the legend have prevailed and have caused many to question the existence of cryptids living deep in the catacombs. But for today's episode, we'll finish on a short but interesting little ghost story. Nick Platt went to a rave in one of the caverns of the catacombs. In the heady atmosphere, someone left off a smoke bomb, which split Nick from his friends. In a corridor, coughing and spluttering, he suddenly realised he was completely alone, and it was completely silent. He felt the panic rise in his chest. He wasn't familiar with the catacombs, and he knew what the danger was. Suddenly from the smoke, in front of him, an arm reached out to grab him. Thinking it was a friend, he extended his hand, hoping to be led from the smoke. And to his horror, his hand passed right through the outstretched arm. The catacombs are a strange place without any doubt. Originally a mine and then turned into a graveyard and then a bizarre, macabre public spectacle. Whether you believe the catacombs are homes of strange creatures or spirits that beckon you to your doom, or if you're Zach Bagans and you believe that it's definitely home to a demon, there is one thing for sure. The catacombs are an incredibly dangerous place. And if you do decide to make a visit, you better make sure that you bring a cataphile.